Birkett Educational Consultants, Defining Moments Canada, Black Canadian Soldiers, Podcast 2. Let's go!
Welcome to episode 2 of Black Canadian Involvement in the Wars. I'm Greg Birkett.
And I am Colleen Birkett. Together, we are Birkett Educational Consultants.
We're siblings and educators. As educational consultants, we work towards creating a more inclusive Canadian narrative and classroom experience by weaving Black voices into every area of the curriculum.
This podcast is part of the Defining Moments Canada project entitled In Defense of Hopes Profound, Canada and the End of the Korean War. The Korean War, often the Forgotten War, is very much a part of Canada's defining moments. Another forgotten aspect of the Korean War and other wars in which Canada participated is the involvement of Black Canadian soldiers. In this final episode, we will discuss the willing participation of Black Canadians in World War II and the Korean War.
Last episode, we discussed the Canadian identity and highlighted the significant participation of Black Canadians in the military from the War of 1812 up to and including World War I. This episode will continue that discussion with a focus on World War II and the Korean War.
Now, as we talked about in the previous episode, when Black Canadians returned home after World War I, they faced a society that was very much impacted by racial tensions. It was a society influenced by the pseudo-scientific theories of race that placed Black people at the bottom of the human hierarchy, as well as the Jim Crow laws of the United States that prevented Black people from having human rights and freedoms. The resultant impact on Black Canadians included not being able to eat in restaurants, sit on the main floor of theaters, skate at local rinks, stay in hotels, and lots of other imposed restrictions. There were some areas in Canada where Black people couldn't even own or rent property. Some towns had what they called sundown laws that required Black people to leave the area before nightfall. Black Canadians also found themselves being offered the jobs that paid the lowest and were considered servile and low status.
During this time, Black Canadians were determined to establish their identity. There were Black communities such as Little Burgundy in Montreal and Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. They were both communities where Black people could actually get housing because they were located close to the railway where many Black men worked as sleeping car porters. Both communities grew and thrived because they worked together and helped each other. They were well known even in America, as popular jazz artists frequented them both to perform and to eat food that was much like what they could get in the American South. Black communities were in existence across Canada, and they had a unique Black Canadian identity. This was the racial reality in Canada when the call to arms for World War II rose up. Canada was still a young nation in the process of establishing its identity, and Black Canadians believed they were a part of this emerging identity. It was just natural that they would desire to enlist for service in World War II.
Black Canadians had other incentives for fighting in World War II. Adolf Hitler was making life difficult for everyone who was not of the Aryan race. When Black American Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in the 1936 Olympics held in Berlin, Germany, Hitler was not pleased because it demonstrated that the Aryan race was not superior. It was reported that Hitler left the stadium when he saw Owens' success. Given Hitler's attitude towards Black people, it was clear that a victory for the Nazis would make life even more difficult for Black people across the world. Black Canadians may have also felt empathy towards the Jews because Hitler especially hated and mistreated them. So Black Canadians were ready to fight for freedom and rights for all.
Again, the Canadian military restricted enlistment of Black soldiers. Black Canadians publicly pressured for the ability to enlist. Reverend Est of the Union United Church in Little Burgundy, Montreal, was instrumental in getting many Black men enlisted. Then, as more soldiers were losing their lives, the Canadian Army became more willing to enlist Black people. There was no segregated battalion in this war, but there were many Black soldiers, some of whom went on to become quite famous. Why don't we know this?
It's a fight for our lives. It's a fight for our pride, standing side by side. Will you recognize eyes?
And this leads us into a part of our episode where we're going to discuss 3 questions or topics. Did you know that? We should know that. And why don't we know that?
So here we go. Did you know that the first Black person to be the principal of a school in Toronto was a World War II veteran? Wilson O. Brooks enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1943 and trained at the No. 5 Bombing and Gunnery School in Defoe, Saskatchewan. He was one of the first Black commissioned officers in the Royal Canadian Air Force to serve in a bomber squadron in World War II. When he was 19, Brooks earned the rank of flying officer. Wilson O. Brooks was also one of the founders of the Ontario Black History Society.
We should know that Stanley Grizzell, the first Black Canadian citizenship judge, also served in World War II. He was conscripted into the army in 1942. Grizzell was somewhat puzzled that Canada was fighting for democracy in Europe while Black Canadians were still not given fair and equal treatment at home. When he was serving in England, Stanley Grizzell was given what was called Batman duties. He was given duties such as shining shoes and cleaning up the officers' quarters. Grizzell refused to do the demeaning and racist duties assigned to him and was given the job of cleaning toilets as a punishment. He reacted by going on strike. This resulted in him being reassigned and then promoted to corporal. Upon his return to Canada, Stanley Grizzell resumed his job as a sleeping car porter and also enrolled in classes at the University of Toronto. He became active in civil rights and politics, which led to his appointment as Canadian citizenship judge.
Why don't we know that there are also Black Canadian military families? The oldest 5 of the 7 Carty brothers from New Brunswick all served in World War II. They followed in the footsteps of their father, Albert Carty, who served as part of the No. 2 Construction Battalion in World War I. Each Carty brother had his own unique role in the military. There was Adolphus, who served as a flight sergeant and airframe mechanic. Another brother, William, was also a flight sergeant as well as an aeronautical inspector. Brother Donald was an equipment assistant and aircraftman second class. Clyde, another Carty brother, was a firefighter and a leading aircraftman. And then Gerald, who at the age of 19 became one of the youngest commissioned officers in the Royal Canadian Air Force.
It was also a family affair for the Waterman family of Toronto. Private Charles Waterman was the first Black Canadian to join the paratroopers and serve in World War II. His sister, Corporal Olive Waterman, also served overseas in World War II.
Now, did you know that while many Black Canadians were overseas participating in World War II, others were at home working in factories that produced weapons, ammunition, and other materials used in the war? And we should also know that Black women made their contributions too. They worked in munitions factories and shipbuilding yards, doing the work of the men who were away fighting in the war. So World War II ended. But in a few short years, Canada's military was again called into action for the Korean War. This is a war that was not as large as the World Wars, and its existence is often forgotten and overlooked. Among the approximately 26,000 Canadians who served in the Korean War, we should know that some of them were Black.
It's a fight for our lives. It's a fight for our pride. Standing side by side. Will you recognize eyes?
Did you know that one of the Black men who participated in the Korean War was honored by the city of Ottawa in 2013? This was not only a way of recognizing his lifetime service to Canada, but also a means of honoring Canada's role in the Korean War. The city park on Brookstone Street in Barrhaven was renamed Gus Est Park. Montreal-born Clarence Gus Est along with some of his friends, joined the Canadian Army Special Force in June 1950. This special force was being raised for United Nations operations in Korea. He had to wait until October when he turned 19 before he could actually join. S completed basic training as a medical assistant in Camp Borden. From there, he went on to Fort Lewis near Seattle, Washington, as a member of the 25 Canadian Infantry Brigade Group for advanced training. After this, S was assigned to Korea as a medical assistant. When he was discharged from service in Korea, Gus was so deeply affected by the horrors of the war that he left the military after 3 years. He worked for Canada Post for a while, but soon re-enlisted in the Army as a part of the Postal Corps. He rose from private to the rank of Master Warrant Officer, and by 1974, he was a captain. By 1977, Est was a major on the Chief Logistics Office staff, where he was responsible for all of the postal operations for the group of United Nations serving in the Middle East. He was a participant in tours to Germany, Egypt, and Cyprus. After 33 years in military service, Gus Est retired in 1987.
Wow, what a busy man. That's why retirement was not the end of duty for him. Service to his community continued to be his priority. He volunteered for organizations such as the Nepean Public Library Board, the Mayor of Nepean's Task Force on Visible Minorities, the Ontario Lung Association, the Korean Veterans Association of Canada, and the Royal Canadian Legion. It was no wonder that in 2013, the Deputy Mayor of Ottawa called Mr. Est a model of lifetime service to Canada and his community. Naming a park after Est was a great way to honor him, as well as commemorate the 60th anniversary of Canada's involvement in the Korean War.
Now, why don't we know about other Black veterans of the Korean War? Errol Patrick, like Clarence S., was born in Montreal. He spent his childhood in Trinidad and Tobago, but returned to Canada in 1945 and enlisted for the Korean War. Errol Patrick joined the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery Regiment as an artillery soldier. He was well respected, serving with honor and distinction, blazing a trail for Black Canadians to serve in the Army. After giving service in Korea, Mr. Patrick did not end his military career. He continued as an instructor with the Battery Command Post of the No. 1 Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant while serving in Germany in 1966, assuming the duty of commanding the troops. When Errol returned to Canada, he was promoted to Chief Warrant Officer at Petawawa, Ontario, and later in Gagetown, New Brunswick. Errol Patrick retired from the military in 1985 after 35 years of service. He was actively involved with the Legion Branch 632 and a firm advocate for the care of veterans. His motto was, "For me, every day is Remembrance Day."
We should know that Black Canadians served in many different areas in the Korean War. We talked about a Black medic and a member of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. There was another Black Canadian soldier who was also part of the Special Force with the Royal Canadian Regiment in Korea. Did you know that Halifax-born Joseph Allen Niles took part in fighting patrols and saw action on the front lines in Korea? In 1951, at the age of 17, Mr. Niles enlisted with the Canadian Armed Forces in Halifax. His basic training was completed at Camp Petawawa in Ontario and his advanced training at Camp Wainwright in Alberta. He left for Korea in 1952 on a troop ship that departed from Seattle, Washington. Niles completed his year of duty, but volunteered for an additional 3-year term. He left Korea at the end of October 1953. When he was discharged from the armed forces, Mr. Niles worked with the railroad. So as you can see, Black Canadians have bravely served Canada in every war effort. Serving Canada in the military was important to Black Canadians and still is. One example is Ernest Albert Reddick, who was born in 1900 in Guysborough, Nova Scotia. He served in World War I and World War II, and then tried to enlist for the Korean War, but by then he was too old. The commanding officer, when he went to enlist for the Korean War, the commanding officer recognized him and said, "Go home, Ernie. You have done your time." Black Canadian soldiers have done their time and continue to do their time. We need to know these stories because they too need to be remembered. Now, Greg, we've got to hear the rest of your poem, summarizing a lot of the things that we've just talked about in this episode.
All right, I think I can do that. A great war breaks out again, and this time around, me and my friends believe that things might actually be different. Not trusting 100%, a little less naive and a little less innocent, though they should be used to me by now after all the time together we've spent. But I guess that it meant nothing to some, as I would still run into rejection and race-based selection at offices of enlistment. Reverend Charles Est at the Union United Church in Montreal's Little Burgundy stood up for me, and eventually you could see me, like the 5 brothers from New Brunswick with the last name Carty, wearing my uniform and repping proudly for my country, keyword my. And in World War II, I proved that I could hit the ground, sail or fly with the best of them, stand toe-to-toe or chest-to-chest with them. Check Jerry Bell, Lincoln Alexander, Stanley Grizzell, A. Seymour Tyler, and the rest of them for details and evidence of blazed trails. I prevail even when others try to derail my destiny in this dominion. Desiring to be the citizen with full access to the standard of living that I envision. Made the decision to join the forces again and head overseas to fight in the Korean War, sometimes called Canada's Forgotten War, after only 5 years of peace. The number of soldiers deceased ranks 3rd on the list of my country's bloodiest military conflicts. But after the massive loss of life in World War I and II, this war is treated like it didn't exist. I was there though, so I can tell you that it did. Fighting for freedom, joining with the UN, this was by no means an easy gig. Clarence Est will tell you about my Korean tour of duty from a medical perspective. Errol Patrick will say that my skill was best displayed in artillery service, where obliterating enemy front lines is the objective. Joseph Niles endorses my involvement in the Canadian Army's Special Forces. I was highly trained and skilled after taking numerous courses. The problem is that sources for what I did and what I do are too few. Too many history books overlook my contributions and what I've been through. My service in Korea wasn't my first or my last. Stand on guard for thee, Canada, with true patriot love in the present and the past. So talk about me, read about me, write about me. Generations of greatness stand on my shoulders. Who am I? I respond with dignity, pride, and with my head held high. I am the Black Canadian soldier.
As always, that was a really engaging way for us to reflect on the things that we've talked about in this podcast. We just want to take the time to thank you for tuning into our final episode in this podcast series. We challenge you to find out more about Black Canadian involvement in the Canadian military.
I wish that these stories were part of the curriculum when I was in school. So here's the challenge. How can we make these stories part of the fabric of Remembrance Day commemorations here in Canada?
The challenge is on. Thank you again for listening and participating in this podcast and for taking up the challenge.
Black Canadian soldiers. Talk about them. Learn about them. Remember them.